biblical genealogy, textual lineages from Noah to Jesus at the Penn Museum. You may have come by it also with the alternate title, Noah, Abraham, David, and Jesus. What's the connection? I'm Dan Cheeley, the director of the Collegium Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture. If you'd like to be notified of our other special events and programs at Penn, please sign the list that's circulating. If you haven't already, I believe it's in the good company of Doug over on the side. No, it's around. It's over in the corner. So if you'd like to, it should be making its rounds. Please sign up. Be grateful to have you. You'd be welcome at the special events that we do. It was an honor to put together this special event with the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, the Jewish Studies program, and the Penn Museum. It was the wonderful staff and curators of the museum who first approached Collegium to coordinate programming around this fantastic centerpiece exhibit, which I know that some of you explored on the way here, but if you did not get to, you should certainly do so. It's directly above the Cayman entrance. Includes many precious artifacts, among them an ancient clay tablet in Sumerian cuneiform from Mesopotamia around 1650 before the Common Era, which contains the earliest version of the Mesopotamian flood story. There are 2 folios from a richly decorated and illuminated Quran from Iran, copied and signed by its scribe in Hamadan in 1164, so it's a signed copy. And the pages that are exhibited in that display feature the Surah Nu, which is the name for Noah, with a mention of the flood and Noah's role as admonisher. And then there's one of the world's oldest fragments of the Gospel of Matthew, written on papyrus and dating to the 3rd century of the Common Era, containing the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, which begins with the lineage of Jesus. The full title of this exhibit is Sacred Writings, Extraordinary Texts of the Biblical World in honor of the visit of Pope Francis. And when our speaker, Dr. Levinson, heard the full title, he expressed delight that we got the Pope to warm things up for him. He also mentioned that it's not totally unheard of for students to sometimes refer to him as Your Eminence. So we hope that you'll honor that here. We're so delighted to have with us today Dr. Levinson, the Albert A. List Professor of Jewish Studies, who began teaching at Harvard in 1988, having previously taught at the University of Chicago and at Wellesley College. His work concentrates on the interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, including its reinterpretations in the rewritten Bible of Second Temple Judaism and Rabbinic Midrash. Professor Levinson has a strong interest in the philosophical and theological issues involved in biblical studies, especially the relationship of pre-modern modes of interpretation to modern historical criticism. Much of his work centers on the relationship of Judaism and Christianity, both in antiquity and in modernity, and he has long been active in Jewish-Christian dialogue. He's also written a few books. The first, The Death and Resurrection of the Beloved Son, The Transformation of Child Sacrifice in Judaism and Christianity, published by Yale in 1995, was extremely provocative and trailblazing. But it was when he wrote about resurrection again, the second or third book, Resurrection and the Restoration of Israel, The Ultimate Victory of the God of Life, also published by Yale, but this time winning a National Jewish Book Award and the Biblical Archaeology Society's Publication Award in the category of Best Book relating to the Hebrew Bible, published in 2005 or 2006. Choice, a publication of the American Library Association, listed his book, Inheriting Abraham, The Legacy of the Patriarch in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as one of the outstanding academic titles for 2013. And his work in these three religious traditions of scriptural interpretation made him an outstanding candidate to deliver this lecture on the Sacred Writings exhibit. His new book, published this year by Princeton, is The Love of God, Divine Gift, Human Gratitude, and Mutual Faithfulness in Judaism. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Levinson.
Thank you very much, Dr. Keeley. I appreciate that introduction very much. I especially appreciate your mentioning various books I've written. You know, I'm sure it doesn't happen at Penn, but where I come from, a lot of professors are egomaniacs and narcissists. And what they do is they require their students to read their own books. That's how narcissistic and egomaniacal they are. I don't do that. I never require students to read my books. I only require them to buy them. If you read it in a library, you borrow someone's copy, I don't know. I don't get anything for that. I don't get my 31 cents when you do that. And I tell them if you buy 5 copies, I'll see that it gets autographed. And if you buy 10 copies, I'll autograph it myself. So I'm especially appreciative. Is this not no one's hearing? Why are they laughing if they don't hear it? Maybe they just laugh because I showed up at the podium. I want to thank the Collegium Institute, and especially Dan Cheeley and Katie Becker, for all their help in making my visit possible. All the arrangements have been excellent, and I realize that a lot of work went into that. And I also want to acknowledge the other people that are listed as sponsors of this lecture: the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, the Jewish Studies Program, and the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. I should say one thing, though, to people who come here because of the Jewish Studies Program announcement on the listserv. You're going to be disappointed because you're listening to a lecture by John D. Levinson, and the listserv referred to a different lecture by Jonathan D. Levinson. Is Jonathan here? No. All right. In that case, I'll just keep going. If he comes in, let me know, and I'll be glad to let Jonathan D. Levinson speak. It's a common mistake. In fact, I'm thinking maybe of using that as my pseudonym. Now, the lecture is connected, as Dr. Cheeley said, with the exhibition here in the Penn Museum entitled Sacred Writings, Extraordinary Texts of the Biblical World. And this took place in conjunction with Pope Francis's visit to Philadelphia a few weeks ago, where he warmed up the crowd for me. The first exhibit, Dr. Cheeley told me, I'm quoting from an email which he delivered in his flawless Chicago accent, is a papyrus fragment of Matthew 1:1, the oldest gospel fragment in North America, and that you see on your handout as text 1. An account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham, Matthew 1:1, text 1 on your handout. That's the oldest gospel fragment in North America. You can see it upstairs. The second is a cuneiform tablet containing the earliest version of the Mesopotamian flood story, a Sumerian flood story tablet, which is very famous. And the question would be, how can we put these things together? He thought that since I've done some work on the Abraham traditions in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, I might be able to speak on the first item, namely the Matthew 1, but in a way that draws the Mesopotamian flood story in as well. Now this was a challenge to me. This reminds me of the practice they used to have supposedly in Eastern European yeshivot, and in Eastern European, I guess the translation of that in English would be yeshivas, the study academies of higher rabbinic learning, where the bocher, the young man who's studying Talmud, would have a Talmud in front of him, and they would supposedly stick a pin in it, and the idea would be to make an intellectual argument that cogently connected each of the texts that was stuck by that pin, even though there might be 20 pages that you just stuck. And if you were a Bucky Bashas, if you were somebody who really knew your Talmud well, you could construct such a logical argument, supposedly. And if you weren't, you gave a lecture like this one. So I'm going to try, the practice might seem absurd, the practice of sticking a pin in a book and then connecting the different texts that are struck by that pin might seem absurd, but in a certain sense, if you think the text you're talking about is deeply interconnected, that it's organic, that it's not simply separate, disconnected passages, but that there is a kind of logic and unity to it. In other words, if you think the texts are in the nature of sacred writings, in the nature of scriptures, for example, as Kohelet or Ecclesiastes says, all given by one shepherd, then this can make sense. You could see the underlying theology being exfoliated, being brought to the surface through an exercise like that. So the first text I want to talk about will involve the ancient Israelite form of the flood story, where the hero is the figure of Noah, as those of you know who've read Genesis or seen the movie. A while back when that movie came out called Prince of Egypt, people asked me, I had students asking me whether I was going to go see it. I said, no, I'm waiting for the book to come out. But Noah's the Utnapishtim or the Ziusudra of the Bible. He's the survivor of the flood, the man who builds an ark and survives the flood. And if you look at that Matthew 1:1, it's interesting that chronologically, the first person mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus is Abraham. It goes Abraham, David, Jesus. So I thought I might make some connection between Noah and Abraham. Both obviously were righteous men of their generation, or at least Abraham is so described in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which in many ways parallels the flood narratives. And both Noah and Abraham receive what I would call an unconditional dynastic covenant. Not that they necessarily become kings, although Talmudic literature does describe Abraham as having become a king, but rather that they have a lineage, they have a genealogy, they have descendants whose very existence is taken to be proof of their fidelity to God and God's covenantal guarantee that their lineage will always exist. The lineage of Noah is everybody. Everybody is B'nai Noach. Everybody is, the whole human race is supposedly descended from Noah, just as the whole human race was supposedly descended from Adam. But in the case of Abraham, there's a specific lineage that's covenantally promised to him, and promises then will rest on his chosen line. They both receive this unconditional dynastic covenant as a reward for their faithfulness and their service. Their family line will continue forever. The universal humanity in the case of Noah, and the people Israel ultimately in the case of Abraham. Israel being Abraham's grandson, Jacob, or Israel. And you can see this in text 2 on your handout. This is from Genesis 9. And God said to Noah and to his sons with him, I now establish my covenant with you and your offspring to come, and with every living thing that is with you, birds, cattle, and every wild beast as well, all that have come out of the ark, every living thing on earth, I will maintain my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the earth. So it's not just human life that the Noahide covenant guarantees. It's all life. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God further said, we're in the middle of text 2, this is the sign that I set for the covenant between me and you, and every living creature with you for all ages to come. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall serve as a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. I will remember my covenant between me and you and every living creature among all flesh, so the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures, all flesh is on the earth. That, God said to Noah, shall be the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that's on the earth. So the rainbow is the sign of divine goodwill, that the floods are over, the waters are over. They won't progress to the level of a cataclysm, of a cosmic flood. Now in text 3, you can see very much the same language, this time applied specifically to the dynastic promise to Abraham, the promise of continuing lineage to Abraham. Text 3 is from Genesis 17. I will maintain my covenant between me and you and your offspring to come as an everlasting covenant throughout the ages, very similar language, to be God to you and to your offspring to come. Here it's not simply all life, all the earth, it's specifically narrowed down to the line of Abraham. I assign the land you sojourn in to you and your offspring to come, all the land of Canaan, as an everlasting holding. I will be their God. So it also involves a land grant, a grant of a continuing family that will have rights of ownership over the land of Canaan. God further said to Abraham, this is the middle of text 3, as for you and your offspring to come throughout the ages shall keep my covenant. Such shall be the covenant between me and you and your offspring to come, which you shall keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and that shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. And throughout the generations, every male among you shall be circumcised at the age of 8 days. As for the homeborn slave and the one bought from the outsider who is not of your offspring, they must be circumcised, homeborn and purchased alike. So there's the whole household of Abraham. The males of the household of Abraham have to be circumcised, whether there is descendants or not. They're part of his family, his familia, his household. Thus shall my covenant be marked in your flesh as an everlasting pact. And if any male who is uncircumcised fails to circumcise the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his kin. He has broken my covenant. Now, these texts have very similar language. The eternal covenant, the unbreakable covenant, God maintaining his covenant, the Hakim Brit, and the sign of the covenant, the rainbow in the case of Genesis 9, and the circumcision in the case of Genesis 17. You might say the way this tends to work within the document that produced this, which I'll say something about in a minute, is something like what in Russian they call these matryoshka dolls. One doll is inside another doll. You ever seen these things? A set of wooden dolls of decreasing size placed one inside another. I want to make sure I got the interpretation right and, in fact, infallible, and so I got that from Wikipedia. A set of wooden, it's on the screen, it has to be true. A set of wooden dolls of decreasing size, one inside the other. All the descendants of Abraham are descendants of Noah, but not all the descendants of Noah are descendants of Abraham. So there's a smaller covenant within a larger covenant. Biblical historical critics of the Bible interested in the complex compositional processes by which the Bible came into existence see these two texts as P, the priestly source. They come from the same source, which is mirrored in the fact and helps us to mirrored in the fact that they have the same conceptuality, the same language, much of the same syntax and vocabulary. So in this vision, this priestly vision, one can't say that God has a covenant only with the people Israel, which in the continuing Jewish tradition we would say are the Jewish people. But one also cannot deny God's covenant with the Jewish people or replace it with the universal covenant. There's a universal covenant, that's the larger doll, and then there is the Abrahamic covenant, understood in this very text, chapter 17, as applying only to Abraham's descendants through Isaac. That covenant is a smaller, more particularistic covenant. In other words, covenant here has to do with what in Christian theology they often call election, or in Jew-speaking English often called chosenness. It has to do with a specific choice that God makes, singling out certain people from the universal human sample, universal humanity. But in doing so, it's not a question of those singled out, and this is where the word election can be misleading. It's not that those singled out are the saved and everybody else is the damned, or those who are singled out are those that God cares about, and those not singled out he couldn't care less about. It's a more complicated pattern. If you read this in the way the word election tends to work in some Christian theology, especially Calvinist theologies, the elect are the saved, and the non-elect are the damned. This is a different pattern. This is a pattern of more universal scope. God establishes a covenant with a promise of continuation and continuing life for the universal humanity, and then singles out within universal humanity the family of Abraham through Isaac for a special covenant with a special sign that differentiates itself from universal humanity, namely circumcision, and is connected to a land grant, the land of Canaan granted to those descendants. As you know, Abraham has more than one child. You know, Abraham had a big problem at the beginning of the Abrahamic narrative in that he's promised he's going to be the father of a great nation. Goy Gadol, but there's a problem here. He's not the father of anybody. His wife is either infertile or too old to have a child, or both. And yet he's going to be the promise. He's going to be the promise of he's going to be the father of a great nation. And since this involves both Catholic and Jewish sponsorship, this group, I thought I would tell a story to illuminate the problem here. One time a Jew got on a bus and sat next to a Catholic priest. And the Catholic priest was wearing the Roman collar. He hadn't yet kicked the habit. And someone moaned. That's how I know that's how I know it works. No one laughed, but someone moaned. I know the mic is working. And he looks at the Jew looks at the priest in the Roman collar and says, "Pardon me, sir, but do you know you have your shirt on backwards?" And the priest turns to the Jew and says, "No, you don't understand. I'm a father." And the Jew says, "Well, I'm a father too. I don't wear my shirt on backwards." And the priest said, "No, you don't understand. I'm a father to thousands." Whereupon the Jew said, "In that case, leave your shirt the way it is and put your pants on backwards." Now, the point is that Abraham is promised he's going to be the father to thousands, but he's not the father of anybody. That's the basic problem here. Finally, he has a son through surrogate motherhood. His wife, his barren wife, arranges for him to have a surrogate mother for the child that she thinks will be her child, legally would be her child, but biologically belongs to her maidservant, which is a fancy biblical English word for slave woman, Hagar. That's what happens just before chapter 17 that we just read. But the problem is, everything seems settled now. Abraham has the promised son, and that promised son is granted fertility and this, that, and the other. Everything looks great. He's going to be a big, tough guy, and this is fantastic. There's only one problem. Then in chapter 17, you discover that Abraham's 89-year-old wife is going to get pregnant at the age of 90, have a baby, right? That's going to be a mess, right? Now what do we do? And the way the priestly source in Genesis 17 sets us up, unlike some of the other streams in the Pentateuch, please don't say Pentateuch, is to say that much of the Abrahamic promise falls. The Abrahamic promise falls on both the previous son Ishmael by the surrogate mother, the Egyptian slave woman, and on Isaac, born to the preferred wife Sarah. But the covenant is only with Isaac. Ve'preti akim et Yitzchak. I will fulfill or establish the covenant with Isaac. With Isaac I will establish the covenant. But my covenant I establish with Isaac. Isaac receives the promise and the covenant. Ishmael receives the promise, blessing, and covenant. Ishmael gets promise and blessing, but not the covenant, and it's with the covenant that the land is associated. So what I'm trying to say is this particular stream in the Pentateuch is interested in balancing in a subtle way these universal and particular concerns. It does it through a covenant theology in which there's a universal covenant and then a more particular covenant, which is with the descendants of Abraham through Isaac. And then even the next generation, it's through the descendants of Isaac through Jacob, not the descendants of Isaac through Esau.